So let me say a few words first about what this is and what I'm going to be talking. Oops, I got to take it off slideshow, I think. There we are. How about that? Let me say a few words about what you're about to see in the next few moments. So at NetScout, for those of you who are unfamiliar, NetScout acquired a company a number of years ago called Arbor Networks, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. That organization was one of the first and perhaps leading and maybe still leading DDoS mitigation and analysis providers. The team that I work on is essentially derives from that original acquisition. I've been at NetScout now for just over a year, but our work is largely evolved in and around DDoS attack threats. And so one of the things that we do, it makes up a significant amount of our work all the time, not just a couple times a year, is looking at what's going on in the world of DDoS. And so we'll produce this threat landscape report. And so this, you're actually seeing literally a reduced version, but just because of lack of time, but you're seeing the first version of this from the first half of this year. But we try to do this every 6 months, essentially. So, and it's interesting to kind of look back and see how things have changed or developed. And things change somewhat slowly, but one of the things I think that will be particularly interesting this year, as will come as no surprise, is I'm going to actually kind of focus more on the regional aspect of DDoS attacks because of what's sort of been happening in the world. So to give you some pictures of that. Now to give you a sense of, how is it that we can produce such a thing? How can we produce this DDoS landscape? Clearly we're not the adversaries who are launching these attacks. How do we know about this stuff? How do we actually get this data? So we actually get contributed data from customers. So we basically have appliances and boxes and equipment that gets put in networks, and people use this to monitor their infrastructure, and the stuff that we have and build can do all sorts of things to look at your network traffic profile, trending analysis. Yes, it can do DDoS attack detection. It can do mitigation. So it may actually apply rules to routers, for instance, like with a remote trigger black hole or flow spec rule. But customers, they can opt in to basically contribute back to us what are effectively what we'll just call attack alerts. And it's really summaries of attacks that they've seen. And we will only see attack alerts that have been what we categorize as a medium or a higher level threshold. And in those attack alerts is basically a summary of the attack event, which may include things like the networks involved and the protocols and the bandwidth and all those sorts of things. Our products, where this information derives from, is based a lot on NetFlow data. So we don't get NetFlow traffic, so we don't get any real private or personal information, although sometimes we'll get some prefixes, but those are often anonymized by the operator may click the anonymize button. So we don't really necessarily get a real fine-grained view of things. So if you were a customer or you were a customer, I hope that somewhat assures you that we're not trying to look at private information about individual connections or users. We really are interested in the landscape. We're interested in the big picture. So keep that in mind. Hopefully, when you're looking through these graphs, that the details are sometimes lost. We don't get to see some of that, but we can extrapolate things out of that. And so I'll try to highlight some of those things for you here. So people like to see numbers on the attacks. How many attacks do you see? What are the levels of throughput that you see in attacks? We don't see everything. Obviously, we're not a provider for every single network in the world. We're a provider for a significant chunk of the internet. We've tried to do calculations on what is we see, what is the percentage of internet traffic we see or potentially see. And the number varies, but we've estimated somewhere between about a third and about a half of the internet's traffic we could potentially get attack summaries for. So that's a pretty good view or vantage point for a DDoS mitigation provider. From what I understand, from what the marketing people tell me and the market analysis says, is that we're the leading provider of being able to do that. So our view may not be perfect, but it's probably a reasonable one. So here's some numbers for you to chew on. I don't find this actually to be all that particularly interesting, but just to give you some perspective. These are based on attacks towards a destination, so attacks towards a target. So over the course of the last year, we've seen roughly about the same level of attacks. This 6 million number is actually fairly consistent with what we saw from the second half of last year. The max bandwidth isn't necessarily the record-breaking stuff you may have heard of. Some people like to publish, oh, we've seen the largest attack, that's ever been seen. And sometimes we'll see those and we'll say, yeah, probably not actually, because we can kind of tell when people are not quite telling the truth, or they're counting in a weird way. We don't necessarily measure what we see in terms of breaking internet records. But to give you a sense of what we are very confident that we've seen in terms of values, we've seen about a terabit attack was one of the largest ones we saw in the first 6 months of this year. Throughput sometimes matters. Packets per second is sometimes more interesting, so I throw that up here as well. Now, the vectors, this is not necessarily the attacks that you might be familiar with, like you might be concerned about very specific types of malware or specific types of protocol breakage or something. The way our product works, as I mentioned, is largely based on net flow. So we have to classify and categorize things simply based on a flow of data. And a flow, as you hopefully know, is this tuple of information that includes things like IP addresses in both directions, and it includes IP protocol and port numbers and things like that. So our product will look at it as like, oh, the majority of this traffic looks like TCP/ACKs, and so we'll classify the vector as TCP/ACK attack. Some of these vectors may be what we refer to as sympathetic. So if you were to see, oh, there's a huge spike in our vectors reporting for ICMP. Well, the ICMP traffic may not necessarily be the genesis of the attack, but ICMP traffic might be sort of a result of networks or hosts being offline. So that's the response to some other type of attack traffic. So just sort of put that in perspective. I wouldn't put too much weight on any of these threat vectors as being necessarily all that important, and like this is the leading class of attacks necessarily. This is how we categorize them. Okay. Now, another maybe a limitation of how we are looking at this data today is we break up the world into 4 very large regions, and this is kind of unfair. And if you're from any particular part of the world, you might not like where you've been grouped. But this is, we have to draw the line somewhere, and this just sort of makes it easier for us to perform analysis. And it's not probably too outside the norm of what the industry might do in looking at the world's data. So we look at it. The first is just from the top to bottom here on the right-hand side of this slide is the European, Middle East, Africa region. Now this is a pretty diverse region, as you might imagine. It stretches essentially from Iceland all the way through Europe to include places like Turkey and Russia and all the Arabian Peninsula, Northern Africa, all the way down to South Africa, right? So this, completely different cultures, economies, populations. So this is really one of the largest and most diverse groupings that we have. Then there's the Asia Pacific countries, places like India and China, Korea, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand is included in that region. The NAMER, that's actually just North America. It's a silly acronym, but it's North America. Clearly, as you would guess, US dominates this region. There's really only a handful of countries that make up North America. In our analysis, technically, the way we group it is actually 4 countries listed in North America. It depends on who you ask. What country is part of North America might be as high as like 20 or 30. But the US dominates no matter really how you count. Canada makes up a substantial portion, but the US is significantly more than Canada, even as you'll see. And then there's what we classify as Latin America, which is essentially Mexico and everything further south, the Caribbeans, South America, and so forth make up that region. The size of the proportion of traffic or attacks here is just sort of an artifact of how we group the countries. So this is perhaps not the best, most interesting way to look at differentiating between the regions. You can kind of maybe see some dips and some peaks here, but it's a little bit hard to pull out really anything too specific just because the grouping consists of so many countries together. But this is the picture that we come up with if we do it that way for the first 6 months of the year. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly over some of this stuff, the attack trends, what sort of the top attack vectors were as we classify them. I'll just simply point out DNS amplification attacks. We've seen a decrease. And this is sort of trending along the last couple of years, largely because the attacks that are really so prevalent now is all the stuff based on like the Mirai IoT types of attacks. Those aren't conducting spoofed attacks. So they're really dominating the levels of attacks we're seeing, the amount and volume. And so all the classic reflection attacks with DNS and NTP and other types of protocols like that are still prevalent, but the proportion of the overall attack landscape seems to be decreasing because of all the IOAT stuff. We look at industries we can classify this way. It's not too much what you would be surprised by. The carriers, the ISPs, the providers, hosting providers tend to dominate the space here. When we sort of hone in on countries, sometimes interesting things pop out. Like we'll see changes with like satellite communications there were some noticeable trends there over the first 6 months this year. Sometimes we see trends with education or banking and whatnot. This global picture I find is somewhat interesting, but I stick this in here just to kind of give you a perspective. So here's the Asia Pacific region. It's made up of a little bit over 35 countries, all sorts of industries that we've seen involved as targets of attacks. And then this is the number of autonomous systems or networks that are involved. Now, I don't know how well you can make out some of these colors. Unfortunately, this is a color scheme I wouldn't necessarily have chosen, but our team likes this sort of ninja black style of presentation, and so I've just kind of went with it. But there's a dark blue component that's sort of leaning at the top. That's South Korea tends to dominate the Asian Pacific, the amount of traffic that we see in DDoS attacks. Now, it's a little bit hard to make out some of the trends, but you'll notice this lighter blue peak right sort of almost in the middle. That, I believe, is the Taiwan's graph. And there was a noticeable spike that we observed coinciding with some public remarks that that government had made in support of Ukraine. We also saw a little bit, not as much, when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. Also, you see some sympathetic attacks targeting countries for just all sorts of geopolitical regions. So those things do tend to show up. That one maybe a little bit less so, but when the Ukraine attacks happened, that was very prevalent for us, and we noticed that right away. Some more countries breakdowns. You can see some of the changes that have occurred over the years. Perhaps more interesting than this graph is maybe something on the right just to kind of highlight. And it doesn't pop out as much because the wired and the hosting provider stuff usually tends to dominate. But voice over IP is probably not too surprising, is seeing a large increase in what's being targeted. Things like streaming media, Zoom, seeing an increase as well. Over in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, again, this is the largest region when we look at in terms of just the diversity, number of countries, and actually the volume of traffic that we see that gets grouped together. Here's where it gets maybe a little bit more interesting and maybe perhaps what you maybe would be most interesting to hear about in this particular presentation, right? Because this is where Ukraine and Russia fall in our grouping. So it's a little, I'll have another graph to highlight that a little bit further, but that red line, the red part of the series that you can see immediately peaks, goes from what was seemed to be kind of a trend. Everyone was sort of hovering around about 500, 600, 700 attacks per day, shoots up and climbs about 2 to 3 times higher. That red line is Russia. So Russia actually saw, from our data, saw many more attacks targeting them. Ukraine, on the other hand, so you can't tell quite as much from this graph, but it's that yellow line. And right around the same time, there was a little bit of a peak with Ukraine attacks targeting them, but there was actually a noticeable drop-off. And there was actually fewer attacks that were targeting specifically Ukraine. Now, there's a few things to say about this. One is, how are you measuring something that's targeting Russia or Ukraine or any other country? We base it on what you would imagine anyone might base this data information on is, the target being an IP address. What is it using third-party data? What is the IP address mapped to from a geolocation perspective? So we use geolocation IP address providers like you all might for different reasons. So that IP address is associated with a particular region of the world, and we sort of assume that that's correct. I think we would agree that geolocation data for IP addressing is imperfect. It's often imprecise. Overall, I think in the grand scheme, taken in aggregate, it's probably reasonably decent and sufficiently accurate. But know that it's a little bit imperfect. But more importantly, why did Ukraine go down? I would, maybe expect that to increase. And that's maybe surprising that Russia increased. I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. I think I have this bug in the slide. It's supposed to be EMEA, the title there. Here's another breakdown and looking at the industries that are targeted. It's really kind of, we see a similar trend. Voice over IP and the streaming media stuff tends to be targeted lately. This has a lot to do, obviously, with all the remote work, a lot of the work from home, the pandemic, and so forth. In Latin America, here's a quick view of that. Brazil dominates here. They're kind of, in some ways, a lot like how US dominates North America. Brazil's it's a huge economy. There's lots of internet activity there. So this tends to dominate. There was a, I don't think there was a particular event here in Brazil that happened, but you kind of see things kind of go up and down. The fluctuations, by the way, it's partially a matter of how we count and how our data times out certain flows and whatnot. And then there's, of course, the weekend effects and vacations effects. So you'll see it very spiky when you look at it at the micro level. We did notice there was a surge in Colombia. That there was a peak somewhere there in March. That when there was an election and the runoff election, there were some attacks. Not perhaps something you would notice unless you were looking for it, but something that comes out in our data when we look at it in aggregate, and we're honing in specifically by country. Here's a view of industries in Latin America. Kind of interesting. Perhaps we see that the green is supposed to be 2000. Oh, it is 2002. Good. We see a little bit of a decrease in some components of this, but overall, Brazil, which has led this, saw a significant amount of attacks TCP-based. Again, that's like the Mirai type of stuff, the non-spoof stuff. So it kind of is in line what we've been more or less seeing globally. North America, here you can clearly see in North America, the targets are far and above everything else, dwarfs. And I don't even know what these other two countries technically are. I'd have to look it up. But it's very minuscule, it's minimal. And here's the breakdown for the industries here. As I mentioned before, we see satellite. We see some elementary stuff that sometimes come and goes, typically around exam time. And we also saw effects of this also in Middle East and Africa, where there's some internet shutdowns that happen because of cheating and so forth, or concerns about that. We see it occur as well. So let me say a little bit more about the Russia-Ukraine event, because I think this is probably the most interesting part of what we saw in the first half of 2022. As that invasion occurred, we saw, and this graph actually shows further back before the first 6 months of the year, the attacks against Russia shot up immediately. Ukraine, there was a little bit of spike and then dropped significantly. Now, let me just see if anyone wants to venture a guess. Why would you think attacks against Ukraine go down? Anyone want to venture a guess? This gentleman.
Infrastructure's been destroyed.
Infrastructure's been destroyed is a good guess. Anyone else want to venture another?
Jason? Refocus on Russia, right? If the attackers are, you might say they're picking sides, so to speak.
Someone's picking sides, those are good. Another reason, I'll let you, person in the back.
Ukraine ISP started blocking everything.
Ukraine ISP started blocking. All very good guesses. Part of all, I'm sure, played a part. Another one, I'm going to cut off the questions. You may have the right answer that I was looking for as making up a big chunk of the reason for this. One of the reasons, the infrastructure that was destroyed, actually, in one of the tucks that you just heard from, has some monitoring in Ukraine, and the monitoring actually never went down, by the way, and it was in Kharkiv, the node. So surprisingly, a lot of the infrastructure in Ukraine, telecommunication-wise, withstood a lot of the invasion. However, one of the reasons, in addition to the ones you just mentioned, is that a lot of the infrastructure that was being targeted moved. And in this graph, it'll show it a little bit if we want to try to point it out, is a lot of the hosting that was being done in Ukraine moved and went to cloud providers or somewhere else. And so Ireland was one of the big places where some infrastructure moved. And so you saw almost an equivalent rise in attacks that looked like they were targeting Ireland, but it was actually just following where the targets were. Okay. So we actually saw that in some of our data. Now you also saw some sympathetic attacks to, like we saw with Taiwan in a previous slide, where they were they saw some attacks sympathetic because they made statements in support of Ukraine. Likewise with Finland. Finland saw a significant rise in attacks targeting them because they also were voicing support and wanted to enter into NATO, and all that other kinds of stuff was, spurring, presumably, attackers to launch attacks against them for that reason. So that we found was very interesting. A lot of it has since largely subsided and things kind of have stabilized, although the attacks against Russia haven't quite gone down to the levels before March. We still see a significant amount of attacks ongoing against Russia. And there's a little bit of a surge that continues with others. But those are some of the reasons that we've found to be, to help explain why some of the shifts that we've seen have occurred. And here's just a little bit another view of some of that as well. Excuse me. So we have Finland up and to the right here in Ireland. You can see there was sort of this natural rise in both of them that seemed to coincide almost precisely with the invasion. So that's it. I wasn't checking the clock, so I have no idea where I am in terms of whether I'm 10 minutes. So I have a little bit of time for questions and ended a little bit early. So if anyone wants to ask me specific questions, there was about 50 slides I threw out because we have a lot more data that we could have showed you, but I wanted to just focus on the regional aspect today. Yes, sir.
So a couple things that you said just made something pop in my head. Well, one thing you said related to Ukraine, and then one of the slides, I think, said telecommunications, non-satellite. It just made me wonder, what, if any, challenges does satellite connectivity for internet, like things like Starlink and just older forms of satellite as well, pose for kind of the accuracy of the data? Do you guys have challenges related to that at all? Or?
That's a good question. What does that pose challenges for us? I'm not so sure. I mean, we'll see traffic based on whatever contributions we get from customers, and if the destination IP addresses appear to be associated with addresses that are affiliated with satellite infrastructure, assigned addresses, then that's how they will show up. I imagine maybe some of the challenges might be that a lot of that type of technology might be one IPv4 address or a small set of IPv4 addresses and things behind NATs. Perhaps that poses a challenge depending on how that IP address is categorized in geolocation data, perhaps. It may overestimate the amount of traffic going to any particular prefix. It may actually be, there may be large amount of infrastructure behind a small number of addresses, perhaps. So it might be hard for us to perhaps estimate. It may also be hard to estimate if a satellite address space covers, a significant part of the world as opposed to a specific country. Yeah, that might pose some challenges for us. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a good question. I haven't really thought about it too deeply. So off the top of my head, that's what I would say is the challenges for us.
In your country comparisons, did you have any opportunity to try to normalize them against like a universal metric, either connected users, devices, or even something like country GDP, where you basically try to flatten them out, because there is such extremes between the United States compared to Canada even. Both are massive economies, but they're still very different, and they skew each other away.
Yes.
So normalizing would be interesting.
Yes. So one of the things that we do, I don't show you here, and you can actually, there's actually a web page. If you want to go look and explore some of this data, NetScout has a page. If you search for NetScout Threat Report, you'll find it. So you can do some of the explanation a little bit deeper and a little bit more specific into the country that might not specifically highlight, here's the GDP association and how it compares with this other country of a similar, or how it compares because GDP now we have to, maybe normalize it for the value of their economy, or the, compare dollars to rubles or whatever. We do break down things a lot by individual country online and in our own personal analysis. I even see things like in the United States, for instance, and this probably shouldn't come as any surprise, just by looking at a state level, right? You see addresses or prefixes that are associated with certain parts of the country, right? You'll see some block of addresses that actually have no association with the U.S. So you may remember the map that Bill showed in the previous presentation. There's a very large circle that was centered right in the U.S. And the reason for that is because the geolocation data for a lot of addresses is unspecific. It just gives a common point. A lot of addresses, I'll just say, well, center of the country, right? So we have things like that that sometimes skew the results a little bit. But we do think about, the size of a country. Sometimes if you read our report, we'll talk about some of those effects, like, there's an outsized influence of attacks against, banking or schools or real estate industries and things like that kind of gets into that a little bit, perhaps. But we're not economists, so I don't know that we're necessarily really getting into the level of detail that maybe we should, that you've sort of suggested. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation and some of the analysis. The Ukrainian, the move of infrastructure was interesting. And this is now the third kind of cyber session, and it's gotten me thinking, a lot of talk has been about IPv4. What are you seeing with IPv6? Is that increasing? Is anyone caring in terms of using it as an attack, a means to attack?
Excellent question, and Alex thanks you for that question, I'm sure. In fact, that was something I've been looking at, and I had actually a couple presentation proposals that I was going to do specifically on that question. Yes, so we'll see V6 data. So, and this, in fact, actually includes V6 data, but I'll tell you, for better or worse, V6 contribution to these graphs is pretty small. Yes, it does exist. Largely what we're seeing is that the V6 attack traffic is largely due simply because of the effects of the DNS maps to a V6 address, and the client just, I got V6 transport available, so I'm sending my packets over V6. It just happens to be by, happenstance that there's stuff over V6. That doesn't mean there's not V6 specific attacks that do happen, they do, but it's really pretty small in comparison to V4. Yes, we do see it. Yes, we're looking for it, and I'm particularly interested in it. There was a presentation I was presenting later this year that's actually going to be postponed. I'll give it probably somewhere else. So maybe ask me again in a few months, and I'll have some of the more analysis put together in a slide deck for you. But thanks for asking that question. And I see no one else rising to the microphone, so I think we're done. So thank you very much for your time and attention.